Welcome to the next episode of the Just Peachy Show. My name is Peachie Thompson, and I'm your host. Just Peachy is a show where we interview leaders and subject matter experts in the fields of insurance, finances, and taxes. We also talk about anything and everything under the sun under our lifestyle section. Today, we're going to talk about something that is all over the news, student loans. And I am excited to introduce to you our next guest speaker, the founder and principal financial planner of Deliberate Finances, Mr. Ryan Frailich. Ryan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm excited to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, so Ryan, tell us about yourself, how you got into financial planning. I know you have a background in education. Tell us, how did you get here?
Sure. My first job out of college was a teacher. So I taught for 5 years teaching middle school math, and then worked also in education as sort of hiring teachers and in human resources. And through that job, got my hands on our retirement plans, insurance, all salary, compensation charts, all these things that touch on finances. And it kind of dawned on me how many really incredibly smart, incredibly well-educated, successful people aren't particularly well educated when it comes to this aspect of their life. Money is considered a thing a lot of people didn't grow up talking about, or if they did grow up talking about it, it was very negatively charged. And so I was just seeing all these incredibly smart people who weren't making, whose decision making around finances didn't match up with all this other really good decision making in some of the other aspects of their life, which kind of kicked off for me an interest. And at the time, I was actually working with a financial planner myself who said, you're seem to be really interested in this stuff. Maybe you should take a class and see if this would be something you want to pursue. And it just, from the first little bit I started getting into the industry, I realized this is kind of the perfect overlap of sort of the analytical thinking and math that I enjoy, and also helping people with something that can be really stressful for them. And so it was kind of a perfect thing for my background and for my interests, and sort of, I got lucky to fall into something that works really well for both what I'm decently good at and also very interested in doing every day. That was 6 years ago, and I ended up launching a financial planning firm in the end of 2016. So coming up on 6 years, 5.5 years or so in business since I launched the firm.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Congratulations. That's a great milestone. Every time you hit every 5 years, I think it's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah,
and I love the background.
Thank you.
Yeah, so middle school math to financial planning.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of a difference there, right? So you are definitely the person to talk about student loans. So a lot of people, well, first and foremost, our country have about 1.7 trillion.
Yep, with
Am I
more
right?
than 40 million individual borrowers. So it's something that touches a lot of people in a very significant way.
Absolutely. Outstanding student loan balance. Amazing. I can't even fathom how much money that is, right? So, and of course, as you know, it's all over the news. Current administration is talking about forgiving loans, loan forgiveness. So, what does that really mean, right? Well, I keep hearing about, what does that mean?
Yeah. I think what's so tricky about that word there, forgiveness, is there's actually 3, 4, 5 different paths of forgiveness at this point. And so there are different things that are applicable or not applicable to different people. And so just because you have student loans doesn't necessarily mean that some of those headlines may or may not apply to you. So we can sort of take them one by one across the different aspects of forgiveness. So I think the one that people are talking about most is some sort of broad-based, for many, many people, not tied to where they work or how long they've worked there or anything like that. Just a broad-based, we're going to forgive X amount across the board. Depending on what proposal you look at, it's anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 to 50,000. President Biden has pretty explicitly said he is not going to do 50,000. There's a debate on the legality of an executive order. But that's sort of the most prominently, I think, talked about route would be, essentially, and this would almost for sure come, from the executive office, not from Congress, because it's pretty clear there aren't the votes in Congress to do it right now. And so that's sort of the tension is the Biden administration has said they'd happily sign a bill forgiving student loan debt, but the number of votes you need in Congress to get that passed. In fact, there have been proposed bills explicitly barring the president from forgiving student loan debt. So it's a pretty contentious issue. So if it happens at all, it happens via an executive action, and very likely would end up in a lawsuit. But that would be, I think the number to work with is probably 10,000. That's the most likely number that has been signaled. That's the one that tends to be talked about. It's not enough in some people's eyes. It's way too much in others. Some proposals for that have had income phase outs. In recent weeks, we've been seeing numbers around like 125 to 150,000 for an individual, and then double that. So 250 to 300 for a couple being the income cap. So if you make above that, you don't get that 10,000. There's also been competing proposals around, should this apply for people who took on graduate school debt or only for undergraduate school loans? So there's a lot of details that are still very murky. And even if an announcement is made, it's very likely to be challenged legally. So I think, that's the one that is hottest on people's minds, but it's very hard to know what happens next. So we're all sort of, looking into our crystal ball to try to make a prediction, but there's no news until there's news, I guess is the best way to say it. So that's one route to forgiveness. So I guess I'll pause there and we can talk about that a little bit and then maybe get to some of the other things that are happening in this space.
Yeah, so how is that different from just doing a loan repayment, right? How do people normally think about student loan repayment? There's an interest freeze that I hear. I mean, how are those things even related at this point?
So I think the first thing that has to be established in any conversation about student loans is that this does not work like debt in every other aspect of our lives works. And so you have to sort of undo a lot of your thinking around what you might do if you're talking about a car note or even a mortgage or credit card debt, because there are options available for student loans that are not available in those other spaces. So I think a lot of people, may apply the same principles around, trying to refinance, but actually there's a lot of bad things that can happen if you refinance student loans. And so I think start from the idea that don't assume it's like any other debt, because it's not. The second piece is to establish, are you someone who's a candidate for forgiveness or not? Now, that was frankly easier 3 years ago to make a determination on, because there were some pretty clear guidelines. You could say, like, you are a person who should go down this path, which is to get your loans forgiven, and we'll talk about a couple ways to do that. Or you're someone who's going to try to pay your balance down to zero, and in that case, we're going to pursue a wholly different set of strategies than the people that we talked about that are going for forgiveness. Prior to this conversation around broad-based forgiveness, there's essentially two main ways that one could get their student loans forgiven. So one is through a program called Public Service Loan Forgiveness, which the high-level summary of that program is if you work for 10 years in a nonprofit or public service, government job, and you make payments on your loans for 10 years, at the end of those 10 years, it's forgiven. There's a lot of nuance in the details there, but that's the basic gist is we want to reward people who make the choice to maybe make less money and go into a public service job instead of a private sector job, and say after 10 years, as long as you've made payments while being in that job, you get your loans forgiven. And then there's also something called income-driven repayment forgiveness, or being on an income-driven repayment plan for 20 or 25 years. So this is where we'll get into how this debt works so differently. So because to some of the numbers you cited, right, there's $1.7 trillion. We have this problem where a lot of people come out from school and they may have, $100,000 of debt and they're making $50,000 a year. And any way you calculate that payment, it's not sustainable. And so the government, for across administration across parties over 3 decades now, has rolled out a series of income-driven repayment plans, which means your repayment is driven by your income. The more you make, the more you pay. The less you make, the less you pay. There's nuance to the different plans and exactly how they work, but the basic gist is, you're not going to have a payment that swallows your entire budget, because that just sets you up for a default, because you're not going to make it if you make $50,000 a year and you have a $2,500 a month student loan payment, like, it's not tenable.
Doesn't make sense.
So these programs exist, and essentially if you get to 20 or 25 years of making payments based on your income, the government has said at the end of that 20 or 25 years, we're just going to forgive whatever's left. You've made a good faith effort. we'll forgive it. So I think those are sort of the three main routes that one could go to forgiveness. Right? There's the broad-based, there's the public service loan forgiveness, and then there's the income-driven repayment. But then there's a lot kind of in the details of each of those that make them more or less appealing, depending on your circumstances.
So, are those things automatic, or do they need to seek out a place to get the paperwork started? So, I mean, how would that work?
Yeah, I think the one that's most important to talk about right now is public service loan forgiveness. So I'm going to talk about that mainly. The reason the income driven repayment, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, is like there's actually a lot happening there where they're trying to improve the way that works and the way the tracking of payment works. But
Yep.
because of when the payment plans came out, the overwhelming majority of people won't be eligible for that for many more years. Like we're talking a decade plus into the future before the
It
wave
becomes.
of people are going to hit the 20 or 25 years. There's a few for various reasons, but there aren't the millions of people that there will be in 2034, 2035. So I think that one for now, it's more or less make your payments in an income driven plan, and hopefully there will be better tracking of those payments in the future because there isn't right now. Public service loan forgiveness is a program that came out in 2007 from the Bush administration and has been continued since then. And this is the one, 10 years public service work. The problem is in the details. To your point, you have to sign up for it. Initially, they're really like the program started, but there actually wasn't even paperwork to get your payments counted. So you couldn't even prove, hey, I'm doing the things that are the requirements of this program. That's been fixed. There's been paperwork out since 2012 or so. But essentially, you file a piece of paper every year and, you fill it out and you say, I work at this school or I work at this nonprofit hospital, any 501c3 or government job. And your employer signs off, yep, Peachy works here. And then you send it in and they say, okay, we've confirmed your employment. We've checked that you made a payment during that time. Great, you get 1 credit. And once you accumulate 120 credits, 10 years, you hit forgiveness. The tracking of that has been, in a word, a mess. And the implementation of it, because it has been so confusing, has led to a lot of people who think they're doing everything right, making one small mistake, but that one small mistake costing them, years and years of forgiveness. So I'll give you an example. You have to have the right loan type. So prior to 2010, the government essentially issued something called FFEL loans. In 2010, they moved to every loan being a direct loan originated through the federal government. Only direct loans are eligible for this program. There are many people that worked in a nonprofit that had FFEL loans that made payments for 10 years, filed the paperwork at the end of the 10 years, were told, oh, you have the wrong loan type, go back to start.
Wow.
There has been a fix for that announced, which is the PSLF waiver. So all those rules that I've just rattled off about you have to have the right loan type and you have to be making a payment every month while in the right type of employment, they're trying to fix that and go back. So the example I just gave, in October, the Biden administration announced we're going to try to rectify that this program has been very confusing, and we're going to try to take the next year to give people who were trying to do the right thing, who made good faith efforts to follow the rules of this program, and we're going to go back and count payments that maybe you paid but it was on the wrong loan type, or maybe you paid but you were on an ineligible repayment plan. So some plans count and some plans don't, and they're going to count all those. So there's a lot of effort being made to fix the problems of the past with that program, and I think it's probably the route that, in my opinion, is the most beneficial to the most number of borrowers. If you look at the percentage of Americans that work in qualifying employment, by most
Yeah.
estimates it's about a quarter of Americans. So if we assume that's 10 million people, if there's more than 40 million student loan borrowers, that's 10 million people that could be potentially impacted by that program. And it's also the one that clears away your entire debt in the shortest time frame, right? So some of the other
Right.
routes that we've talked about are either a partial amount of debt or in a really long time frame. So
Yeah.
it's the one that is probably going to be the most advantageous to the largest number of people if they can navigate it.
Yes. So, and that could get very confusing too, because someone could be in and out of both the public sector and the private
Yep.
sector. So now you have, I mean, the proper tracking of that is key.
Yep. And it's one thing I think now there is more information out, and there's more systems in place, and there's more I guess structure in place to help people navigate it. But if you go back in time, a lot of people, were in the dark on this for the first 5, 6, 7, 8 years of the program. To your point, you could go in and out of the right type of employment, which can make it hard to know, should I be pursuing forgiveness, or would it actually cost me less money to just pay that off, right? I think where I start with a lot of clients is the idea of a forgiveness is appealing, but if you have to pay more money on the route to get your loans forgiven than it would just take to pay it to zero anyways. Like, I know it sounds nice to have someone just say, poof, and I erased your debt. But if the requirements to get there require you to pay more money than it would take to just pay it off anyways, you shouldn't do it. And I think that's where it gets confusing for someone who, like you said, is in and out of private or public sector employment, or back and forth between the two. Right. It can be confusing to know which route am I on and which one makes the most sense for me.
Yeah. Totally. So I'd be thinking about how are they tracking this? Is it cumulative, for my credits? Now do I have cumulative 10 years in the private sector, or the public sector, and do I deduct the time that I'm in my private thing? So I see people getting loan refinancing mailers. You talked in the beginning, let's not treat this as a regular debt, right? So
yep.
Talk to us about that. What considerations should a person have in mind when looking at refinancing student loans?
Yeah. So I'll start from the standpoint of, I think most people should not refinance their student loans. Now, I'm going to get into why. I just want to start with the declaration, and then we'll talk about why. So refinancing is different than consolidation. Those two terms get conflated a lot. So let's say I would go to undergrad and I take out 30 grand of debt, and then I go back and I go to law school and I take out 120 more. So here I am in my 20s and I have $150,000 of student loans, all taken out through the federal government. Now, upon graduation, I get 6 months before I have to start paying. And then that grace period is for me to decide how am I going to deal with my $150,000 of student loans. If I go and work in big law and have some big salary that makes it possible for me to pay this off, then my strategy might be that I'm going to pay this down to zero, in which case you probably think of it a lot like most debt. Okay, if I put it in 5 years, that's going to be a massive monthly payment. That's probably, it's the best from an interest standpoint because shorter timeline, lower interest. But it's probably not feasible for most people to pay off $150,000 in 5 years, even with a really great salary. Okay, You can stretch it the other way and go 30 years. That might make it a much more feasible on a monthly basis, but it balloons your total repayment costs. So you're kind of thinking like you would for other debts.
Debt. Mm-hmm.
This is where refinancing might be an appealing option. You come out, you're like, hey, I have a $200,000 salary at a law firm downtown. It's not a public service job. I'm not interested in going into a public service job. Okay, you might want to look at one of those refinancing offers and consider if the reduction in your interest rate makes it worth it. So up until pretty recently, a lot of interest rates for federally originated debt are between 5 and 7%. And up until very recently, you could refinance for 3.5%, 4.5%. So put that on a big loan balance, and it can be a tens of thousands of dollars saving. The downside is, as soon as you refinance your loans, you have left the federal system, and anything that happens in the federal system, any flexibility offered by the federal system, any forgiveness given by the federal system, any deferment and forbearance in case you lose your job or something happens and makes it hard for you to make that payment, you have just given up your right to all of it. So you better be very, very certain you don't need any of those benefits.
Wow. So that's huge. And that's not something that an average person would think about, right? So all these talks in the news right now, that loan forgiveness, so on and so forth, if someone has had a refinancing done, doesn't even apply to them. Is there even talks of...
Nope.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt your question. I'm guessing that your question was, is there talks of rectifying that for them?
Yes.
There's no go backs. I've actually had this conversation. So in my own work, I have 2 people I'm thinking of right now who refinanced. And remember, I just said I'm not a big fan of refinancing. So it takes me a lot to get there. It has to be a pretty unique case set of circumstances. Mm-hmm. But it made sense in their cases. They weren't on the track for forgiveness. They could get a much lower rate. The savings to doing so was in both cases more than $10,000 over a decade. And so it made sense. Both of them completed it in late 2019 to early 2020.
Okay.
Boom, CARES Act, March of 2020. Everyone in the federal system has had their loans, not everyone, the vast majority of federal borrowers have not been required to make a payment and have not had any interest accrual on their loans now for 27 months.
Right.
Whereas my clients that refinanced have been paying that whole way. So, I think
Ouch.
the 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 contrast has been heightened because of this freeze. Now, eventually, this freeze will come to an end, and we can maybe talk about that. But it's just a really stark example of some of the things you could lose out on. Now, no one could have predicted a student loan freeze. It had never happened before. Certainly, no one thought in March 2020 that it would go on. Here it is, May of 2022. We know for sure it's going for another 3 months. Most people I talk to think it's going more than another 3 months. So that was very unpredictable, but it just goes to show what you could potentially lose if changes are made to the federal system that make it more beneficial. Um, so refinance with caution is, I guess, what I would say.
Mm. So what you mentioned, people, you've been talking about this, and we think that the freeze will probably extend beyond the next 3 months. Why is that?
Both politics and policy. So let's start with the politics first. It's 2 months before an election in which the Democratic Party doesn't look like they're going to do particularly well. Does it make sense for the White House to say, hey, everyone, 2 months before an
Mm,
election, you have to start making these payments again? I,
mm,
I get that from a policy standpoint, why they wouldn't want to do that. I actually think the logistics, though, of restarting payment and the policy questions that need to be answered are the bigger holdup. So there is a tremendous amount of, pardon this word, uncertainty in the student loan world right now. So you've got this forgiveness question. We don't know if there's going to be an executive order on forgiveness, if there is, how much and who it qualifies for, and we don't know what the legal challenge to that might be. So say they announce, I don't know, tomorrow, loans are turning back on September 1st, and we're forgiving $10,000 of loans for everyone. And the next day, someone files a lawsuit, and now it's held up in court. They're not going to. I would be surprised if they turn payments back on while also not being sure whether or not this order is going to go through for forgiveness. That just seems kind of like it doesn't make sense to start up the entire machinery of the student loan system for 40 million borrowers while not even knowing, some of them might have no debt after that forgiveness, depending on what the amount is. So it just doesn't make sense until that question is resolved. Two, the federal government contracts out with private servicers. So if you have student loans, you probably pay a company named Navient or Mohila or FedLoan or Great Lakes. There's a few others. They are private companies that the government contracts to do the servicing of the debt. So they're the ones that, track your payments and who you pay, and you call if you have questions. They're kind of the front line of customer service for it. Only several of those have resigned in recent years, so they've given up their contracts to it. So there are the two biggest, Navient and FedLoan, are both getting out of this business, but they haven't fully exited the business yet. So they still have a bunch of student loan borrowers with federal student loan debt that are linked to their systems that they're going to transfer to another servicer at some point
mm,
in the coming months. It doesn't make sense to turn student loan payments back on until that is finished, because otherwise you're adding another gigantic uh, procedural thing into the mix when there's already the transferring of accounts across tens of millions of people happening. So you've got uncertainty around repayment, where and when it starts. You've got servicer uncertainty, and then the Biden administration has announced, I mean, really three fairly major changes to student loan policy. So the PSLF waiver that I mentioned, where they're kind of going back and giving grace to people that maybe made mistakes to PSLF. They
right.
recently announced also something called an IDR waiver, income driven repayment waiver. It's kind of the same idea. It's saying, like, hey, if you were trying to use this plan and got steered in the wrong direction by a servicer, we're going to try and give you credit for that. But it's a very labor intensive thing to do, to go back and look at, did this person make the payments in 2013 that they say they did? Oh,
Yes.
well, let's check the servicer. Oh, that servicer actually transferred the loans to this other servicer. So we have to go back two servicers in time to check whether or not we should give this person credits for their 2013 payments. It's very labor intensive. And so you've got all of these things happening in the student loan space, and then we're going to also turn on payments, which means we have to send out notices to borrowers. We have to tell people what their payments are going to be. We have to make sure everyone knows who they're supposed to pay now, because a lot of people are going to pay a different company than the company they were paying in March 2020 when payments turned off. That all happening in 3 months from today when we're recording, I just can't see it. If I
I'll
had
have
to
to agree,
venture a
yeah.
guess, and I say this with like 51% certainty, so you can see how confident I am. If I had to venture a guess, January 1, maybe February 1 is when this happens. I just can't imagine that the system has enough capacity, human capacity, technological capacity, to turn it on any sooner than that and not have it be a total mess.
Sure, it sounds like it. That is a lot. I did not realize how messy it is, quite frankly. And
Yeah.
these are a lot of the things that must be considered while our current administration is going back and forth as to what they're going to be doing with this whole student loan balance forgiveness, right? And when does that happen? Right?
The forgiveness, it's,
Yes, if,
you
if
know,
if they agree on something, when does it happen?
so if you had asked me this question a year ago, I would have said I think it's pretty unlikely. But what I've been advising my clients to do, so say you're a borrower and you've got, I'm making up a number here, $25,000 of student loans left, and you're a person who's paying it to zero, so you're not going for any sort of public service forgiveness. I might say, on the one hand, if you make a payment now, it's 0% interest, so it's really cool that you can knock your balance down really quickly because all of it's going to the principal and none to the interest. However, I think you should just sock all your payments into a high yield savings account somewhere because we don't know if some sort of forgiveness is going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but let's just wait and see. I've been saying that for, a year and a half, 2 years now. In the last few months, there's just been headline after headline after headline that makes clear that the administration is talking about some form of forgiveness. There have been NPR articles, and Bloomberg and Politico have all reported that there are like heavy discussions happening. We know that the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has been pressuring the administration, as well as the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as like Senate Major Schumer and Elizabeth Warren. Like a lot of these names have been talking to the administration about it, and there's been a lot of leaks about how that's going. So it's clear that you know there is activity happening, but there's been no timeline announced, and there is no deadline necessarily. The deadline feels like it has to be tied to the repayment starting again because it feels like if you're going to make gigantic changes to the system, they should be coordinated so you're not doing
You
one
would
thing and then
hope,
having
yeah.
it undone later. But there isn't any hard deadline that necessarily is pushing this. Some of it is tied, depending on what legal authority the president tries to use for it. Some of it is tied to like the emergency declaration around the pandemic. So the question is like, if that runs out, does he have the authority to do it? That goes beyond my knowledge, frankly. But they don't necessarily have to at any point. I think the other big thing is, and I think this is a compelling argument against forgiveness. I'm fairly pro forgiving student loans in a lot of ways because I just think the system has been so poorly designed that we basically need to start fresh. However, if we don't actually start fresh and we forgive a bunch of debt, we're just in the same position 10, 15, 20 years from now. So there's a lot more structural problems around how we got here that need to be addressed. And wiping $10,000 or $30,000 off the balance of current borrowers does nothing to fix how we got to the position we're in today. And so the administration's like kind of working on a short-term timeline, it seems like, but then there's huge changes to how we structure and finance higher education that also need to be changed. Otherwise, we just repeat the same problem over the next 2 decades.
Right, and then it's a definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again. And you're right. If they are forgiving anything and then creating the same problem essentially in an identical way, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I
Doesn't
mean,
make sense.
it sends a signal to any undergrad borrower who's, fairly or unfairly, let's say you're an 18-year-old and you're deciding between, the state school in your state that's offering you a full ride and X Ivy League
Expert.
school that says you can come here, but it's going to be 60 grand a year out of your pocket. And you're looking at that and your parents are talking about it and you're trying to figure out if it's worth it, and then they forgive a bunch of debt. Well, you're probably going to think, well, whatever, I'll sign up for this debt and they're going to forgive it anyways, so it's
That's right.
fine. And like, I don't agree with that thinking. I think that's that would be a huge risk to take on. But I can understand why someone would think that. Like, why wouldn't they think that if they
Yeah.
see that a bunch of other people took on a bunch of student loan debt and got theirs forgiven, so they can just go, oh, they'll do the same thing for me in 10, 15 years. It won't be, yeah, it's a big number, but I will never have to pay it back anyways. Like, that just, we got to sort that out, or at least have some idea of how that will be sorted out before forgiving won't just make the problem worse in the long run.
Right, and there goes the question of what does your eight ball, the eight ball say? Like that magic eight ball, if you've ever seen it, is like you shake it and then it just, what is it that you do, right? So, Ryan, this has been very, very informative, and I could talk about this all day, and there's a lot of other details that I want to get into, but I know time is limited, so I appreciate you being on this call, on this podcast. If there's anyone who would like to ask more questions about this, how can they get in touch with you? What is the best way for them to do?
Absolutely. I'll give my own information and I want to point you to a couple other resources as well. So, you can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet. You might find a person, Google my name, you'll find me. It's Ryan at deliberatefinances.com. Feel free to email me. I also know the scope of this problem is far beyond what I could ever dream of addressing, so I want to give a few other references. The website studentloanplanner.com is a very good company that gives very good advice on student loans, and you can sign up for a consult via their website, and you pay a few $100s and get an individualized consult with an expert. There's also an organization, there's a certification, the Certified Student Loan Professional, CSLP, of which I, have that certification. There are also several hundred other people that have that certification. And so if you search Certified Student Loan Professional, you'll get to a website that has a searchable database of people who every one of them has passed a rigorous test about student loans, and every year has to pass another test that stays up to date with the ongoing and evolving changes. So if you're looking for help on your situation, I think studentloanplanner.com, CSLP search, and the third thing I would give you is studentaid.gov actually has a lot of very good information. It is not always easy to find that good information, but if you really click around a lot on studentaid.gov, you will find quite a bit of useful information about all of these programs we've mentioned, and it is the government's website, so I think it's helpful to understand it direct from the source. And yes, people like myself or the student loan planner team can interpret it and kind of apply it, but if you're looking for kind of the primary source, that's where you'd find it.
Awesome. Thank you. Ryan, are there any final words you want to share with our listeners?
I guess the biggest thing I would say is just keeping in mind that student loan debt does not work like other debt, and I think that is a misconception that not just the general population has, but a lot of people who call themselves financial planners have. I've talked to a lot of financial planners who don't understand anything about the income driven repayment or PSLF or all these other aspects, and so especially given that people who have gone to graduate school oftentimes have six figures of debt. The numbers are really large, and you want to make sure like it is well worth paying a few $100s to someone who specializes in this stuff to make sure you're not making a six-figure sort of mistake or five-figure sort of mistake. I know that sounds very salesy and sales pitchy, but I just think like it's important that you recognize that the things that might apply in other areas of your life simply don't in student loans. They didn't before the last couple of years, and they certainly don't now.
Right. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I look forward to the next time we connect, and I hope you have a fantastic trip.
Thanks for inviting me on the show.
All right. Information shared during the show are opinions of the speakers. They are not legal, financial, or tax advice specific to you. Consult your own specialist, attorney, accountant, financial planner, or insurance advisor for your specific situation.